Allan Pinkerton, The Railroad Mysteries. Chapter 1, Whispers on the Tracks. The office of Allan Pinkerton in Chicago, though modest in size, had become a nerve center for intrigue and investigation. The detective's reputation as a relentless pursuer of truth had spread across the nation, drawing to him cases both common and extraordinary. On a brisk evening in October 1862, as the winds from Lake Michigan rattled the shutters, a courier delivered a folded letter marked with the seal of the Illinois Central Railroad. Pinkerton, accustomed to the sight of urgent appeals, slit the envelope with his penknife and read the message by the dim glow of a desk lamp. The letter spoke of disappearances, railroad men vanishing without explanation from the stretches of track between Cairo and Decatur. Lanterns abandoned on the rails, meals left untouched, duties forsaken mid-task. It was not desertion, the writer insisted, but something stranger. Alongside the vanished men came reports of missing cargo, rifles and powder intended for Union regiments in the South. Though rumors swirled of Confederate agents, the men on the line whispered of a ghostly presence, a phantom railman walking the night. Pinkerton frowned as he folded the letter. Superstition often cloaked criminal enterprise, and he had no patience for phantoms. Yet he knew the value of rumors, for they shaped the courage, or cowardice, of men. If fear spread unchecked among the workers, the rails themselves would grow useless, the lifelines of the Union severed by whispers. He resolved to leave for Cairo at once. That night, he boarded the southbound train from Chicago, his coat collar raised against the chill, his notebook secure in his breast pocket. The station bustled with activity, soldiers moving in columns, merchants hawking newspapers, mothers clinging to sons bound for the front. Amid the din, the detective's keen eyes scanned faces, noting nervous glances and hurried movements. Every station was a theater of human drama, and Pinkerton had learned that criminals often revealed themselves not by their words but by the weight of their silences. The train whistle shrieked, and the great machine lurched forward. Pinkerton settled into a wooden seat, the steady rhythm of the rails beneath him. Across the aisle, a cluster of railroad men played cards, their voices subdued, as though reluctant to disturb the night. One of them, a weathered man with a scar along his jaw, leaned toward his companions and muttered a tale of the brakeman who had vanished 2 weeks earlier. Left his lantern on the ties, the man whispered, burning till dawn. Not a soul saw him step off. It's like the rails swallowed him whole. Pinkerton adjusted his hat to shadow his eyes, feigning disinterest while his ears absorbed every word. Another man laughed nervously, insisting that thieves had spirited the brakeman away for refusing to join their plot. But the scarred man shook his head. No tracks in the gravel, no struggle. Just gone. He shivered as though the memory chilled him more than the autumn wind. The detective's gaze drifted to the window, where the darkness beyond the glass seemed alive with suggestion. Forests loomed like sentinels, their branches clawing the star-strewn sky. The rhythmic clatter of wheels on iron rails became to his imagination a series of whispers, voices rising from the track bed, warning of perils unseen. He reminded himself that reason must triumph over fear, yet even he felt the weight of the unknown pressing against the night. At the first stop south of Kankakee, Pinkerton disembarked briefly, stretching his legs and surveying the platform. A young telegraph operator approached, cap in hand, and offered news of another disappearance. This time it was a porter who had vanished while escorting a shipment of crates marked as machinery but rumored to conceal rifles. The crates themselves were gone as well. Some say the ground swallowed him, the boy stammered, for not a trace was left behind. Pinkerton thanked him with a curt nod and boarded again. He wrote in his notebook by lamplight, disappearance of brakeman, lantern abandoned. Disappearance of porter, cargo vanished. Fear of phantom railman. Possible Confederate involvement. He paused, tapping the pencil against the paper. The name of one man recurred in whispers across railroad reports: Benedict, a wealthy industrialist embittered by disputes with the Illinois Central. Pinkerton underlined the name but left it unproven. For now, he required evidence, not conjecture. The journey stretched into the small hours. At each halt, Pinkerton observed the exchanges of passengers, farmers, soldiers, drifters, yet his instincts tugged at him to watch the ones who carried little luggage but much nervousness. One man in particular caught his notice, a traveler clutching a leather satchel as though it contained his very soul. The man's eyes darted at every sound, and sweat beaded his brow despite the chill. Pinkerton noted him silently, resolving to follow should the opportunity arise. By dawn, the train rolled into Cairo, where the Mississippi and Ohio rivers met in a confluence of commerce and conflict. Soldiers in blue uniforms crowded the platforms, their rifles slung casually as though the war were a distant storm. Yet Cairo itself bore the scars of tension, taverns filled with whispers, alleyways thick with secrets, and a railroad depot humming with unease. Pinkerton descended, drawing the brim of his hat low, and felt the eyes of strangers upon him. It was not merely a new city he had entered, but a battlefield of rumor and deception. As he walked toward the depot office, Pinkerton considered the words of the letter once more. Men vanishing without trace, cargo stolen with surgical precision, and fear spreading like wildfire among the ranks of workers. Somewhere in these shadows moved the hand of conspiracy, cloaked in tales of ghosts to shield its deeds. And Allan Pinkerton, with his notebook, his reason, and his unyielding resolve, would be the hunter who turned whispers into confession and phantoms into flesh. He closed his notebook, slipped it into his coat, and set his jaw. The railroad mysteries had begun. Chapter 2: The Vanishing Brakeman. The depot office in Cairo was a low brick structure, its windows filmed with soot from passing locomotives. Inside, a single oil lamp fought against the gloom. Pinkerton introduced himself without ceremony to the station master, a stout man with pale eyes who seemed both relieved and uneasy at his arrival. "You've come about the brakeman," the man said, lowering his voice as if even the walls might be listening. The brakeman's name was Thomas Hale, 24, born in Kentucky, a diligent worker with no debts and no enemies the station master could name. Hale had been last seen 2 weeks prior, checking couplings on a freight run near Mounds, a quiet stretch of track flanked by swampland. When the train arrived in Cairo, Hale was gone, his lantern still swinging from a hook as though he had meant to return. The men searched the line, the ditches, and even the marshes, but not so much as a boot print had been found. "What of his family?" Pinkerton asked. "None nearby. A widowed mother in Louisville. We sent word, but she knows nothing." The station master wiped his brow with a handkerchief. "The men talk of spirits, Mr. Pinkerton. They whisper in the bunkhouse that Hale was taken by a phantom railman, an old soul angry at the living for daring to run steel across his resting ground." Pinkerton's lips tightened. "And do you believe it?" The man shifted uneasily. "I believe in tired men who need their wages. If they think the rails are cursed, they'll quit, and then we'll have no trains at all." Leaving the depot, Pinkerton walked the length of the yard. The air smelled of coal smoke and river mud. Switchmen moved with weary precision, their boots clanking on iron. Every face he studied bore lines of strain, the unmistakable mark of men who feared the dark more than the work itself. He spent the morning gathering accounts. A fireman swore he had seen a tall figure in a tattered coat pacing the trestle near Mounds on the night of Hale's disappearance. A conductor claimed he had heard moans under the rails, as if the earth itself cried out. A laborer muttered of hearing 3 sharp knocks echo from the boxcars when no one was inside. Each story, different in detail, carried the same note, terror. By noon, Pinkerton arranged to ride with a freight crew on the very stretch of track where Hale had vanished. He donned the plain clothes of a workman, knowing that men spoke more freely around those who shared their burdens. As the locomotive rumbled south, he climbed atop a boxcar, the wind tearing at his coat, and let his eyes sweep the horizon. The line cut through wetlands where herons lifted like ghosts from the reeds. The swamp water gleamed with a dull sheen, and in the distance the skeletal remains of old cabins leaned against the sky. At Mounds, the crew halted. Pinkerton descended, notebook in hand. He traced the path of the brakeman's duty, lantern hook, coupling lever, wheel inspection. Nothing amiss, save for one detail. Near the gravel bed he found impressions, faint but deliberate, of boot heels that had not belonged to Hale. They led not into the swamp but parallel to the rails, as though someone had shadowed him in silence. Pinkerton crouched and ran his hand across the gravel. Mixed with the cinders was a thread of oil, the kind used to grease axles. It formed a narrow trail toward the tree line. Following it, he discovered broken branches and the print of a wagon wheel half submerged in mud. There had been no ghost here, but men with purpose and a conveyance ready to spirit someone, or something, away. That night, back in Cairo, Pinkerton secured a room above a tavern near the docks. The air was heavy with the scent of whiskey and river water. From his window he could see barges creaking at their moorings, lanterns bobbing like fireflies along the levee. He set his notebook on the table and recorded his findings: no evidence of spectral abduction. Tracks of unknown men present. Evidence of wagon. Cargo theft likely tied to Hale's disappearance. His writing was interrupted by a knock at the door. A young boy, no more than 12, stood trembling in the hall. "You're the detective, ain't you?" he whispered. "I got something to show." Pinkerton followed the boy through twisting alleys to a warehouse by the river. Inside, hidden beneath tarpaulins, were crates stenciled with the mark of the Illinois Central. The lids had been pried, the contents rifled. Among the empty straw lay scraps of military cloth and discarded papers. One slip bore numbers arranged in columns, too neat for chance, possibly a cipher. "Where did you find this?" Pinkerton asked. "Men brought M off the train last week," the boy said. "I seen M by lantern light, but when I yelled, they paid me to keep quiet. Said if I told, the phantom would take me like it took the brakeman." Pinkerton gave the boy a silver coin and sent him home. Alone in the warehouse, he examined the ciphered page. The pattern hinted at schedules, perhaps dates of shipments. Someone with knowledge of the railroad's operations was feeding information to a larger hand. The next day, Pinkerton sought out the scarred railroad man he had overheard on the train. Over mugs of bitter coffee, the man confessed that Hale had been uneasy before his disappearance. Said he thought someone was following him. He'd spot a figure on the embankment, same place 2 nights running. Thought it was a tramp. Then he was gone. Pinkerton leaned forward. Did Hale mention a name? The man hesitated. Only once. He muttered about Benedict. Don't know if it meant a friend or an enemy. But he looked spooked when he said it. The name struck like a hammer. Benedict, the industrialist whose disputes with the Illinois Central were infamous. Pinkerton wrote it down with deliberate care. That evening, he returned to the swamp where the wagon tracks had vanished. Lantern in hand, he pressed deeper into the reeds until he came upon a clearing. There, half buried under mud and cattails, was a fragment of cloth torn from a uniform. Nearby lay a boot, its leather scored with a knife slash. Inside the boot was a scrap of paper, stained and blurred but legible enough, cargo to be moved, wait for signal. Pinkerton stood in the damp silence, the lantern's glow reflected in the still water. The brakeman had not been taken by spirits. He had been silenced because he had stumbled upon men plotting theft on a scale greater than ordinary crime. As he turned back toward the track, Pinkerton's resolve hardened. Hale's disappearance was no isolated mystery, it was a piece of a larger puzzle, one that reached into the wealth and politics of Illinois. Whatever Benedict's hand in it, Pinkerton intended to draw him into the open. The Phantom Railman, he concluded, was nothing more than a mask, a story to keep workers docile while traitors stole the very weapons meant to defend the Union. But the mask was cracking, and Pinkerton was ready to tear it away. Chapter 3, A Passenger's Secret. The passenger cars of the Illinois Central were filled with a restless mixture of humanity, soldiers traveling under orders, merchants clutching receipts, farmers selling their grain to the army, and the occasional gambler who sought to turn wartime chaos into personal profit. Pinkerton knew that within such crowds one could often find both victims and villains, for anonymity was as valuable a currency as coin. He had taken his place in the second-class car, a worn but steady carriage with wooden benches and a faint smell of coal smoke that clung to everything. The train jolted forward, carrying him away from Cairo and toward the rural stretches of southern Illinois. His eyes, however, fixed upon one man, the traveler with the leather satchel he had noticed days earlier. The man was in his 30s, dressed plainly in a gray coat and black cravat, but his posture betrayed tension. He kept the satchel pressed against his thigh as though afraid it might vanish if he loosened his grip. Sweat gathered on his brow, though the morning was cool, and his eyes darted toward the windows whenever the train slowed. Pinkerton feigned drowsiness, tilting his hat forward, but beneath its brim his gaze never wavered. When the conductor passed through, stamping tickets, the man presented a pass with a confidence that seemed rehearsed rather than natural. Pinkerton caught a glimpse, too brief for certainty, yet long enough to sense that the ticket bore the faint smudge of a counterfeit stamp. At the next station, the man excused himself to stretch his legs. Pinkerton followed at a discreet distance, stepping onto the platform as soldiers boarded. The traveler slipped into the telegraph office, remaining inside for several minutes. When he emerged, he looked relieved, as though having sent word to a Confederate. Pinkerton noted the time, the station name, and the direction of his glance toward the freight yard before the man reboarded. Back in the carriage, fate delivered an opportunity. The man excused himself again, this time to the lavatory, leaving the satchel beneath his bench. Pinkerton moved swiftly, sliding across the aisle and lifting the bag with practiced care. The lock had been filed thin, easy enough for his deft hands. Inside lay a bundle of papers, maps of rail junctions, lists of cargo, and what appeared to be timetables with certain entries marked in red ink. More telling still were several forged passes, each bearing different names and seals, all crafted to allow unrestricted travel on the Illinois Central. Pinkerton replaced the contents quickly and restored the satchel. By the time the man returned, none would suspect his secret had been uncovered. Hours later, as the train approached a remote siding, the man grew visibly anxious. He rose, muttering something to the conductor, and stepped into the passageway. Moments after, the train jolted with an unscheduled stop. Passengers looked around in confusion. When Pinkerton hurried to the door, the man was gone. The detective leapt onto the platform, eyes sweeping the barren landscape. Beyond the siding stretched open prairie broken only by thickets of scrub. In the distance he glimpsed the figure of the man running hard toward a grove of trees, satchel in hand. Pinkerton gave chase, his boots striking the earth in a relentless rhythm. But by the time he reached the grove, the man had vanished. No broken branches, no rustle of undergrowth, only silence. Searching the ground, Pinkerton discovered a peculiar sign, the imprint of wagon wheels, freshly cut into the soil, leading toward the river road. The man had leapt into a waiting vehicle, vanishing as quickly as smoke in the wind. Pinkerton returned to the train, where the conductor muttered apologies to restless passengers. "Strange fellow," he said of the vanished traveler. "Claimed he was sick, begged to be let off. Didn't think he'd run off like that." Pinkerton offered only a grim nod. In truth, the escape was confirmation rather than failure. The satchel's contents had revealed a pattern. The disappearances of men like Thomas Hale were not random acts of cruelty but steps in a coordinated plan. The forged passes allowed enemy agents to infiltrate crews. The maps and timetables pointed toward specific shipments, those bearing weapons. The traveler had been no ordinary passenger, but a courier ferrying intelligence along the rails. That evening, Pinkerton secured a quiet table in a tavern near the depot at Anna, a modest town surrounded by farmland. He ordered coffee, ignored the din of card games, and spread his notes across the table. He traced the red markings on the timetable, comparing them to known military shipments. Each one corresponded with a cargo that had disappeared or been delayed. Whoever directed the scheme knew the railroad's movements with precision. That suggested an informer embedded high enough to access schedules and manifests. As he wrote, a shadow fell across his table. A young waitress, carrying a tray, leaned closer and whispered, "You're looking for the man with the satchel, aren't you?" Pinkerton raised an eyebrow. "You've seen him?" She nodded quickly. "He came through here last week. Met with two men in the alley. They gave him envelopes. I only noticed because one dropped a paper when the wind blew." She produced from her apron a crumpled slip. On it were rows of numbers in a hand too deliberate to be idle scribbles. Pinkerton studied it carefully. The numbers bore resemblance to the cipher he had found in the warehouse. Columns, repetitions, intervals. It was a code, meant to mask information about shipments. The waitress had unknowingly placed in his hands another piece of the puzzle. He paid her with a generous coin and a warning to speak of it to no one. Then he copied the numbers into his notebook, already turning over possible keys for decryption. Later that night, he boarded another freight train northward, intent on returning to Cairo to compare findings with his earlier discoveries. As the train rattled through the darkness, he stood alone at the rear platform, the wind clawing at his coat. Somewhere ahead, men plotted to cripple the Union by bleeding its supply lines. They used fear of phantoms to cloud the eyes of honest workers, but their true mask was secrecy and code. Pinkerton stared into the night and thought of Hale, of the missing porter, of the courier who had melted into the trees. He felt the case tightening like a noose around the name Benedict. The industrialist's reach was long, his wealth sufficient to buy loyalty, and his grudges deep enough to fuel treason. The whistle shrieked, the train thundered on, and Pinkerton resolved that the next step must be to break the cipher. For once the code yielded its secrets, the entire machinery of the conspiracy would be laid bare. He closed his notebook with a snap. The railroad mysteries were deepening, and every mile of track seemed to hum with danger. Chapter 4, Blood on the Trestle. The morning after returning to Cairo, Pinkerton boarded a freight train bound for the high Trestle bridge near Mounds. Reports had whispered of sabotage along that span, a dangerous stretch where one loosened bolt could hurl an entire train into the swamp below. If there was to be proof of conspiracy, Pinkerton believed it would be there, written not in rumor but in steel and wood. The trestle itself loomed against the sky like the ribs of some colossal skeleton, its beams rising from the murk with austere grandeur. Below, the swamp spread in a vast mirror of stagnant water, broken by reeds and the occasional ripple of unseen life. The autumn sun bled pale light through morning mist, casting long shadows across the track. To any ordinary observer it might have seemed another piece of engineering, but to Pinkerton it was a battlefield waiting to be tested. A foreman met him on the northern approach, a hard-mouthed man named Corbett, whose crew had been tasked with inspections after reports of strange noises in the night. Corbett insisted there had been nothing unusual save for men's fancies. Yet when Pinkerton requested a closer look, the foreman reluctantly accompanied him across the timber beams. Halfway across, Pinkerton halted. Something glinted in the join of the rails. He knelt, pressing his gloved fingers to the bolts. Two had been loosened, deliberately, not by weather or wear. The marks of a wrench were fresh. Corbett paled but said nothing. A few paces farther, Pinkerton found more, a splintered beam where someone had wedged an iron bar to weaken the structure. And on the timber itself, dark stains crusted in irregular blotches. He touched them lightly, then lifted his fingers to the light. Blood. Corbett muttered an oath. One of my men, maybe. An accident. Pinkerton's eyes narrowed. Accidents don't carry off bodies. Where is the man who bled here? The foreman had no answer. The crew insisted all were accounted for, but Pinkerton's gaze told them he did not believe it. He continued his search until he discovered a trail, faint smears leading down the embankment into the woods. Without hesitation, he descended into the undergrowth, leaving the men uneasy atop their trestle. The forest swallowed sound. Dew clung to every leaf, and the air smelled of wet earth. Pinkerton moved with careful steps, following the crimson flecks until they coalesced into a grim path. At its end lay a man sprawled against a tree, breath shallow, shirt soaked with blood from a wound across his ribs. His eyes flickered open as Pinkerton knelt beside him. Name, Pinkerton urged. The man's lips quivered. A whisper escaped, Benedict. And then he exhaled a final rattling breath. Pinkerton closed the man's eyes with a measured hand. Whoever this worker had been, he had died carrying a secret too heavy for life. His last word was confirmation, Benedict's name tied directly to blood spilled on the rails. Pinkerton searched the body quickly, finding a pouch containing nails, a wrench, and a slip of paper marked with a symbol, a circle bisected by a line. Not a company mark, but a sign of recognition among conspirators. He pocketed it before covering the man with his coat. On his return, he confronted Corbett. Your men are being watched, recruited, or killed. This bridge would have collapsed beneath the next heavy load. Tell them ghosts did it if you like, but I know whose hand guides the tools. That evening, Pinkerton carried his report to the railroad superintendent in Cairo. The man blanched as Pinkerton laid out the evidence, loosened bolts, sabotage aimed at military shipments, and the dead worker's final word. The superintendent admitted, reluctantly, that Benedict had long opposed union contracts awarded to rivals. He had the means to bribe, the bitterness to betray, and the connections to place men where they were most dangerous. But Pinkerton was not content with suspicion. He needed proof that Benedict's hired agents were responsible. Proof that could stand in court, or at least in the eyes of Union command. So he devised a stratagem. He would ride the midnight freight across the very trestle targeted for collapse. Disguised once again as a common laborer, he would keep watch for any hand that moved against the rails. He sent word ahead that the train would carry not only timber and coal but also crates disguised as ordinary freight, inside them, decoys suggesting rifles. If the saboteurs struck, they would reveal themselves by going after the shipment. The night of the test was moonless, clouds cloaking the stars. Pinkerton took his place in the caboose, lantern dimmed, revolver heavy at his side. The engine roared into the dark, sparks trailing like fireflies. Every creak of the timber beneath the wheels seemed amplified, every shadow along the line a lurking threat. As the train neared the trestle, Pinkerton spotted movement on the embankment, 3 figures crouched low, their lanterns shaded. He climbed the roof of the caboose, the wind knifing at his face, and signaled forward with a coded flash. The engineer applied brakes, slowing just enough to prevent disaster if the rails gave way. The figures darted forward, tools in hand. Pinkerton leapt down, revolver drawn. "Hold," he shouted. The men scattered like startled deer. One hurled a crowbar, narrowly missing his head. Another fired a pistol, the shot sparking off iron. The fight spilled onto the tracks, the shriek of steel against steel echoing into the swamp. Pinkerton grappled with one saboteur, wrenching the pistol from his grip. A second tried to flee but stumbled into the beam where the bolts had been loosened. The timber cracked, sending him plunging into the black water below with a scream that cut short too suddenly. The third man surrendered, hands raised, eyes wide with terror. Pinkerton bound him swiftly and hauled him back toward the caboose. Under questioning, the prisoner broke within minutes. He admitted they had been hired under false names, paid in gold by men who answered only to Benedict. Their orders were clear: disrupt Union supply lines, cause panic among workers, and cloak the crimes with tales of phantoms to scatter suspicion. Why wears no uniform yet serves the Confederacy as surely as any regiment? The name Benedict recurs. He funds and directs sabotage under guise of folklore. Next step, pursue the chain of command, uncover the shadow company he employs, and lay bare the entire machinery. He closed the book and exhaled. The case had spilled blood now, and the Trestle bridge stood as both warning and challenge. He knew Benedict would not stop with one failed attempt. Another strike was coming, sharper, bolder, and more desperate. The rails beneath the Union's lifeblood were alive with danger, and Allan Pinkerton intended to ride them straight into the heart of the mystery. Chapter 5: The Shadow Company. The morning after the Trestle incident, Allan Pinkerton sat in his room above the depot in Cairo, sorting the threads of his investigation. His journal now held a grim pattern: men vanishing, cargo diverted, rail lines sabotaged, and each event tied, however faintly, to the name Benedict. Yet Benedict himself remained distant, insulated by wealth and reputation, the kind of man who could dine with Union officers by day and sabotage their lifelines by night through intermediaries. If the conspiracy were to be unraveled, Pinkerton needed to pierce the layer of hired men shielding the industrialist. He needed to find the company within the company, the group of renegades and traitors who had made themselves Benedict's hands and eyes upon the rails. That afternoon, Pinkerton walked the crowded levee district, where warehouses sagged under the weight of provisions and wharfmen shouted orders through the damp river air. He dressed as a common clerk, hat low, coat frayed, and carried himself with the weary gait of one who handled ledgers rather than revolvers. From taverns to boarding houses he listened, buying a drink here, dropping a coin there, letting his ears be filled by idle tongues. By dusk, he had his lead, a name muttered by a half-drunk switchman, the Shadow Company. They were said to be a band of railroad men who no longer served the rails but sold their loyalty to the highest bidder. Too disciplined to be mere tramps, too organized to be chance thieves, they were whispered about in tones of fear. And at their center was a captain named Mallory, a man once dismissed from Pinkerton's own agency for brutality and greed. The revelation stung like betrayal. Mallory had been clever, resourceful, and utterly without conscience. Pinkerton remembered the man's piercing eyes and quick tongue. Expelled from the agency, he had evidently found a patron in Benedict, one willing to pay for ruthlessness. That night, Pinkerton tracked the rumor to its source, a ramshackle tavern on the edge of town called the Lantern's End. Its windows glowed faintly, and the murmur of dice and fiddle drifted into the street. Inside, men crowded around tables, their laughter carrying a hollow edge. Pinkerton slipped into the shadows near the bar, sipping stale ale while he observed. Soon, 3 men entered, roughly dressed, with the bearing of workers but the alert eyes of soldiers. They were greeted with discreet nods and led to a back room. Pinkerton followed at a distance, his steps silent. Peering through a crack in the wall, he saw Mallory himself seated at the table, broad-shouldered, his beard coarse, his hands calloused from years of labor and violence alike. He spoke in low tones, but Pinkerton's ear, trained in patience, caught fragments. Next shipment, disguised as timber. Benedict's orders, governor's train. The words chilled him. Mallory was not speaking of petty theft. They planned to strike a train carrying Illinois' governor, an attack that could shake public confidence, halt rail traffic, and sow panic across the state. The meeting broke with handshakes and the passing of envelopes heavy with coin. Pinkerton withdrew before discovery, but not before he had seen enough to confirm the scope of the conspiracy. The following days he set about infiltrating the Shadow Company. Using a false name and the guise of an out-of-work railman, he approached their haunts, offering his services. His reputation as an investigator was well known in the higher circles, but among the common ranks, he was just another stranger with a willing pair of hands. He carried himself with the rough language of a laborer, never too polished, never too probing. It was not long before one of Mallory's lieutenants approached him. "Work's plenty, if you don't ask questions," the man growled. "We guard cargo, we shift crates, we silence gossips. Pays better than the company line." Pinkerton accepted, concealing his satisfaction. For several nights, he labored alongside the Shadow Company, hauling boxes from train cars under cover of darkness. The crates bore false markings, sometimes labeled as farm tools or coal, but inside were rifles, powder, and uniforms. Each shipment was spirited away into wagons that rolled southward toward hidden depots. The men were disciplined. They used signals, spoke little, and obeyed Mallory without hesitation. Yet Pinkerton observed weaknesses. They drank heavily after a job, boasted in whispers of Benedict's wealth, and left patterns in their movements. One night, while hauling crates near the river, Pinkerton feigned clumsiness and tore a corner from a manifest. Hidden in his pocket, the scrap contained numbers and names he would later decode. Another time, he followed the wagons at a distance and saw them enter a secluded barn marked by the same circle and line symbol he had found on the dead worker. Inside, he glimpsed rows of stacked rifles awaiting distribution. But his most valuable gain came in the form of overheard words. Mallory, drunk with confidence, boasted to his men that Benedict himself would soon ride a train north disguised as a grain merchant, inspecting the work. "The governor's run is near," Mallory said with a leer. "When the rails break, Illinois will learn who truly rules the line." That night, Pinkerton returned to his rented room and wrote feverishly in his journal, "The Shadow Company exists. Led by Mallory. Operates under Benedict. Objective, derail governor's train. Must intercept before disaster." The knowledge weighed heavily on him. He understood the stakes, if a governor perished under Benedict's scheme, the Union's trust in rail supply would collapse. Panic would ripple through the state, weakening the war effort at its roots. He also understood the danger. Exposed too soon, his infiltration would end in his own disappearance, another whisper of a phantom railman. He would need to act with precision, dismantling the Shadow Company piece by piece until Benedict himself stood revealed. Pinkerton decided on his next step. He would ride once more with the Midnight Express, not as a guard this time, but as bait. If Mallory's men planned another strike, Pinkerton would meet them head-on. Only by capturing them in the act could he secure the testimony and evidence that would tear Benedict's schemes apart. As he prepared, he felt a rare flicker of grim pride. These were not mere thieves he faced but men who had turned industry into a weapon, commerce into war. And he, Allan Pinkerton, once a cooper and now the Union's most trusted detective, would face them upon the rails where rumor met iron. The lantern in his room burned low as he closed his journal. Outside, the whistle of a departing engine echoed across the river, a reminder that the lifeblood of a nation pulsed through the tracks. Somewhere in the darkness, Mallory and his men plotted, confident of victory. But Pinkerton smiled faintly to himself. Shadows could not stand long when the light was turned upon them. Chapter 6, The Midnight Express. The night chosen for the trap was moonless, the sort of darkness where even the stars seemed reluctant to bear witness. Allan Pinkerton dressed not as a detective but as a laborer, rough coat, soot-stained cap, and gloves already worn thin. In his pocket he carried only his notebook and a revolver with 2 chambers loaded, for subtlety was more useful than a fusillade of bullets. He boarded the Midnight Express quietly, blending with the freight crew assigned to guard the train's precious cargo. The express was no ordinary freight. Though the crates bore labels of timber and seed, within lay decoy shipments, wood blocks cut to the size of rifles and casks filled with sand rather than powder. Pinkerton had insisted on the ruse himself, reasoning that if Mallory's men attempted another raid, their hands would be caught not upon government arms but upon his trap. The locomotive hissed like a restless beast, its black bulk glistening with condensation. Lamps swung in the night air as crewmen hurried about their duties. The engineer, a veteran railman named Jasper, gave Pinkerton a wary glance but asked no questions. Orders from the superintendent had silenced all doubt. With a shriek of iron, the train lurched forward, carrying its deception into the wilderness. Inside the boxcar, Pinkerton settled on a crate and let the rhythm of the rails thrum beneath him. He listened to the wheels strike sparks, the groan of timbers, the mournful whistle echoing through the marshes. His companions were 3 young guards, barely older than boys, who clutched their rifles as if they were lifelines. They whispered about phantoms, their nerves stretched thin by tales that had rippled through every depot along the line. Pinkerton spoke little, merely urging them to keep eyes sharp and hearts steady. He knew the real danger was not specters but men who used superstition to mask treason. Around midnight, as the train roared through a cut of forest, Pinkerton sensed the shift. The whistle fell silent, though no station lay ahead. The locomotive slowed with unnatural caution, as though compelled by hands outside its crew. Pinkerton rose, lantern shielded, and moved to the sliding door. Through a gap he glimpsed figures on the embankment, their lanterns shaded to slits of light. He gave a low whistle, the prearranged signal. At once, Jasper eased the brakes, halting the train short of the trestle. The figures, expecting a full-speed run, looked confused. Then they rushed forward, tools glinting. Pinkerton leapt down from the boxcar, revolver drawn. "Stand in the name of the Union," he barked. Chaos erupted. One saboteur swung a wrench, sparks flying as it struck the rail. Another drew a pistol and fired wildly into the night. Pinkerton's shot cracked in reply, shattering the man's lantern and plunging the ground into darkness. Shouts filled the air as guards spilled from the cars, rifles ready. The battle sprawled across the rails like a desperate dance. Men grappled in the dirt, lanterns overturned, beams of light flashing across straining faces. Pinkerton locked arms with a tall brute, the man's breath hot with whiskey, his knife flashing. They crashed against a wheel, the blade missing his ribs by inches. With a sharp twist, Pinkerton sent the man sprawling, disarming him with practiced precision. From the shadows came Mallory himself, heavier than Pinkerton remembered but with the same wolfish eyes. "Pinkerton," he growled, leveling a revolver. "I should have finished you when I had the chance years ago." "Benedict buys your loyalty cheap," Pinkerton replied, circling. "But treason never pays in coin, it pays in blood." Mallory sneered and fired. The shot tore past Pinkerton's shoulder, scorching cloth. Before Mallory could fire again, one of the young guards lunged, striking his arm. The revolver fell, and Pinkerton seized the moment, pinning Mallory against the rail. The struggle was fierce, but Mallory's boastful strength could not match the detective's cold discipline. Within minutes, Mallory was bound, his curses silenced by a gag. The rest of the saboteurs, seeing their captain fall, broke. Some fled into the woods, vanishing into darkness. Others surrendered, dropping tools and pistols. Two lay bleeding on the ground, one from Pinkerton's shot, another from a guard's bayonet thrust. When the noise died, only the hiss of the locomotive remained, its plume of smoke curling upward like a ghost released. The young guards looked around in disbelief. They had survived, though their hands still shook. Pinkerton ordered them to secure the prisoners, then climbed aboard the caboose to take stock. Inside one captured satchel, he found letters sealed with Benedict's crest. Though unsigned, the language revealed orders: disrupt the line. Strike fear. Delay shipments. The governor's train is to be our triumph. Pinkerton felt a grim satisfaction. The evidence was at last tangible, not whispers or conjecture but ink and seal. Yet one page troubled him, a map of routes extending beyond Illinois, marked with circles at strategic junctions. The conspiracy was wider than he had feared. Benedict had not sought merely to harass one railroad. He aimed to cripple the very arteries of Union supply, from Cairo to Louisville, from Springfield to St. Louis. Dawn crept over the horizon as the train rolled once more, prisoners secured in the caboose. Pinkerton sat with Mallory, watching the man's defiance falter under silence. The once proud captain of the Shadow Company now looked more like a common thug, bound and beaten by his own overconfidence. "You played at ghosts," Pinkerton said coldly, "but in the end you're nothing but a man who sold his soul. And men like you always end the same way, before a judge, or before a firing squad." Mallory spat blood and muttered, "Benedict will bury you." Pinkerton wrote the words in his notebook without reply. He knew Mallory's capture would not end the threat. Benedict still moved in the shadows, wealth protecting him from direct exposure. But with the evidence of letters and the testimony of captured saboteurs, Pinkerton had cracked the mask wide open. When the train pulled into Cairo at sunrise, crowds gathered. Word spread quickly that Pinkerton had ridden the Midnight Express and broken the phantoms who haunted the rails. Workers cheered, though their eyes still held doubt. For rumors were not slain by victories, they lingered like smoke. Yet hope glimmered anew. Pinkerton stepped down from the caboose, the bound saboteurs in tow, and delivered them to Union authorities. His work, however, was far from done. For in 2 days' time, the governor himself was scheduled to travel by rail, and Benedict's plan, to derail both train and confidence, was still in motion. The detective retired briefly to his room, scrawling a final line in his journal before resting. The shadow company is broken, but the hand that guides them remains. Benedict must be unmasked before the governor's ride. The rails themselves will decide the battle. He closed his eyes to a few hours of uneasy sleep, knowing the war upon the tracks was far from over. Chapter 7: The Governor's Ride. The day of the governor's journey arrived with a tense stillness that hung over Cairo like a veil. Soldiers patrolled the depot platforms, their bayonets glinting beneath a pale sun. Railroad officials barked orders, determined that no delay would mar the departure. The governor of Illinois, Samuel Whitmore, was due to board the special train bound for Springfield. His presence meant more than ceremony. He carried with him documents securing further Union contracts, as well as promises of reinforcements. The safety of his passage was therefore paramount. Allan Pinkerton stood among the bustle, his plain clothes doing little to hide the authority that clung to him. He had slept only in fragments since the ambush on the Midnight Express, yet his mind burned sharp. Mallory's capture had revealed much but not enough. Benedict's letter spoke of a strike upon the governor's train, and Pinkerton knew too well that such men rarely abandoned a plan after one defeat. He moved among the guards, checking their weapons, murmuring instructions. Eyes sharp at every stop. Trust no uniform, no pass without scrutiny. If anything feels amiss, bring it to me directly. The men nodded, recognizing the iron certainty in his tone. The train itself was a polished affair, 4 passenger coaches and a baggage car, freshly painted, brass fittings gleaming. The governor's carriage, at the rear, bore curtains drawn against the autumn chill. Soldiers boarded first, followed by staff and clerks. Finally Governor Whitmore appeared, tall and lean, his frock coat impeccable, his features composed though shadowed with worry. He clasped Pinkerton's hand firmly. "Mr. Pinkerton, I hear it is by your vigilance this train still runs at all," he said. "I do my duty, sir," Pinkerton replied. "But the enemy does not rest. We must be prepared for treachery, even within our own ranks." The governor inclined his head gravely and entered his carriage. At noon, the whistle shrieked, and the train rolled northward. Pinkerton positioned himself in the corridor between cars, where he could survey both guards and passengers. The scenery slid past, flat fields, skeletal trees, farmhouses with smoke curling from chimneys. Yet beneath the calm surface lay tension, every mile carried the possibility of ambush. An hour into the journey, Pinkerton's instinct stirred. A conductor passed through, his cap low, his manner oddly stiff. He presented papers too readily, as though rehearsed. Pinkerton's eyes caught the faint irregularity of the seal, ink that smudged rather than impressed. He followed silently as the man moved toward the governor's carriage. When they reached the vestibule between cars, Pinkerton stepped forward. "Your papers," he said evenly. The conductor hesitated. "Already shown." "To me," Pinkerton clarified. His revolver glinted as he drew it half an inch. "Now." The man's hand twitched toward his coat. Pinkerton lunged, seizing his wrist and slamming him against the wall. A knife clattered to the floor. Guards rushed at the sound, binding the man before he could struggle. From his pocket spilled a folded sheet, diagrams of the train, with notes on couplings and brake lines. "Another of Benedict's," Pinkerton muttered. But he suspected the infiltrator had not acted alone. He pressed forward through the cars, his eyes darting to every shadow. Passengers stared uneasily, sensing danger though not comprehending its scale. At the baggage car, he found 3 men loitering near the couplings, their uniforms inconsistent. Before he could speak, one jerked a lever. The train jolted violently. The rear carriage, the governor's carriage, shuddered as though about to tear free. Pinkerton shouted, "Guards! To the rear!" He sprinted down the corridor, boots pounding. Outside, through the windows, he glimpsed 2 more figures leaping from the embankment, signaling frantically. They meant to uncouple the governor's coach, let it roll to a halt in isolation where ambush awaited. Pinkerton burst into the rear vestibule just as one saboteur clambered along the platform. The man swung a crowbar at the coupling pin, sparks flying. Pinkerton fired, the shot striking the iron beside the man's hand. Startled, the saboteur lost his grip and fell screaming into the ditch below. Inside the governor's carriage, confusion reigned. Clerks clutched satchels, the governor himself standing tall though pale. "What is it?" he demanded. "An attempt to detach your coach," Pinkerton answered curtly. He gestured to the guards. "Bolt the doors. Keep low." The second saboteur leapt aboard, knife drawn. Pinkerton met him head-on. They struggled in the narrow vestibule, steel clashing against steel, the train rattling beneath their feet. With a swift blow, Pinkerton slammed the man's wrist against the iron frame, forcing the knife to drop. He struck him hard across the jaw, sending him sprawling unconscious. But even as he bound the man, Pinkerton heard shouts from ahead. Smoke billowed near the engine, another group had seized the forward car. He raced along the swaying corridor, dodging panicked passengers, until he reached the cab. Inside, Mallory's lieutenants had overpowered Jasper the engineer, dragging him aside while one pulled at the throttle. Sparks showered as the train lurched dangerously fast toward a curve. If they gained control fully, the entire express could derail. Pinkerton fired into the ceiling, the blast echoing like thunder. "Drop it," he commanded. The saboteurs hesitated, but desperation gleamed in their eyes. One swung a shovel, forcing Pinkerton back. Another lunged for Jasper's revolver lying on the floor. In the chaos, Pinkerton seized a length of coal shovel and struck hard, sending the weapon skidding. The engineer, bloodied but conscious, scrambled to the controls. Together they wrenched the throttle back, the train screeching as sparks sprayed along the rails. The saboteurs, realizing defeat, attempted to leap from the moving cab. One succeeded, vanishing into the fields, the other fell short, his cry swallowed by the roar of the wheels. At last, silence fell save for the engine's heavy breathing. Jasper slumped against the boiler, nodding thanks. Guards rushed in, hauling the captured man away. Pinkerton exhaled, sweat streaking his brow. The plot had been foiled, but only narrowly. The governor's carriage remained intact, its couplings secured, its passenger alive. The conspirators had gambled everything on this strike, and lost. Yet Pinkerton knew their defeat was not final. The captured men would point to Mallory, and through Mallory, to Benedict. But Benedict himself still moved unseen, his wealth insulating him from exposure. The battle had shifted, but the war of shadows endured. As the train slowed into Springfield hours later, crowds gathered to cheer the governor's arrival. Few knew how close he had come to death on the rails. Pinkerton stood at the platform's edge, his eyes scanning the throng. Applause filled the air, but he listened for whispers, always whispers, that might betray the next move. That night, in the quiet of his lodging, he wrote a single line in his journal: "The governor's ride survived, but the serpent's head remains. Tomorrow, Benedict must be unmasked." Chapter 8, Justice on the Iron Road. The morning after the governor's safe arrival in Springfield, Allan Pinkerton rose before dawn. Sleep had been shallow, the echo of clashing steel and the hiss of steam haunted his mind. Yet his purpose was clear. The governor lived, the saboteurs were in custody, and the shadow company had been broken upon the rails. Still, the architect of it all, Benedict, remained untouched. A victory without his fall would only be a pause in the conspiracy. Pinkerton left his lodging and walked through Springfield's quiet streets. Autumn leaves scraped along the cobblestones, and lamplighters extinguished their torches as the sun climbed. He moved with deliberate steps toward the courthouse, where Mallory and his captured lieutenants awaited formal charges. He knew Mallory's pride might yet be his undoing. Inside, the jail stank of sweat and rust. Mallory sat shackled, his eyes bloodshot but still defiant. "You think you've won," he spat as Pinkerton entered. "You're a fool. Benedict will never be touched. He's richer than senators, friend to generals. He'll walk where he pleases while you chase shadows." Pinkerton regarded him coolly. "We'll see. You have two choices, Mallory, rot in prison as a traitor, or speak and earn what mercy you can. Which will you choose when the gallows is built?" For the first time, Mallory's eyes wavered. He was a man who feared no fight but could not steel himself against the rope. After long silence, he muttered, "Check the ledgers. Benedict keeps everything, payments, names, instructions. He don't trust memory. It's all hidden in his rail office in Chicago. Top drawer, locked box." Pinkerton leaned closer. "And if I find it? Then you'll have his soul in ink." Mallory slumped back, defeated. That afternoon, Pinkerton boarded a northbound train, his resolve set. He carried with him the signed confession of Mallory, enough to secure warrants. The journey back to Chicago seemed longer than ever, though the steady rhythm of the rails lent him focus. He reviewed every step, every clue, the vanished brakeman, the ciphered codes, the forged passes, the ambushes, all threads weaving toward one inevitable confrontation. By the time he reached Chicago, dusk had fallen. The city pulsed with wartime energy, factories clanging, soldiers drilling, newsboys shouting headlines. Benedict's office stood near the stockyards, an imposing brick building with tall windows and polished brass fittings. To any passerby, it was the headquarters of a prosperous businessman. To Pinkerton, it was a lair. He entered with warrant in hand, flanked by two deputy marshals. The secretary protested, but Pinkerton brushed past. Inside, Benedict himself sat behind a mahogany desk, his silvered hair neat, his expression calm. He rose with practiced dignity. "Mr. Pinkerton," he said smoothly. "What is the meaning of this intrusion?" "The meaning," Pinkerton replied, "is treason." He laid the warrant on the desk. "Your men have confessed. Your letters have been seized. The sabotage of the Illinois Central bears your hand." Benedict's smile did not falter. "Absurd. I am a businessman. My enemies smear my name to weaken my contracts. Produce proof, if you claim to have it." Pinkerton's eyes glinted. "I intend to." He moved to the drawer Mallory had described. The lock resisted only briefly before yielding. Inside lay a metal box. Pinkerton pried it open before Benedict's furious gaze. Within lay ledgers bound in leather, pages filled with neat columns of names, dates, and sums. The entries were unmistakable, payments to Mallory, to saboteurs, to men along the line who had betrayed their posts. Beside them, coded instructions mirrored those Pinkerton had already intercepted. The marshal seized the books, holding them aloft. Benedict's composure cracked at last. His face drained of color, and his hand gripped the desk as though to steady himself against collapse. "You'll regret this," he whispered. "No," Pinkerton said firmly. "You will." Benedict was arrested then and there, his protestations drowned by the shuffle of boots and the slam of irons. Outside, news spread like wildfire. Crowds gathered, some jeering, some stunned. The great Benedict, once untouchable, was paraded through the streets as a traitor to the Union. The trial began within weeks. Witnesses included railroad men who had been coerced, clerks who had copied schedules, and Pinkerton himself, who presented the ledgers in court. Mallory, offered leniency in exchange for testimony, recounted the orders he had carried from Benedict's lips to the saboteur's ears. The jury required little deliberation. Guilty on all counts. Benedict was sentenced to life imprisonment, his fortune seized for the Union cause. His empire crumbled, his name cursed where once it had commanded respect. For Pinkerton, the case closed not with triumph but with sober reflection. He walked again along the rails near Cairo, watching trains thunder northward with rifles and food for Union regiments. The line hummed with renewed confidence. Workers labored with steadier hands, their fear of phantoms fading at last. Yet even in victory, Pinkerton knew how fragile such security was. Rumor had nearly undone the work of armies. A whispered ghost on the tracks had cloaked treason so effectively that men had vanished without trace, and cargo had bled away into enemy hands. He thought of Thomas Hale, the brakeman who had walked into the night never to return. Hale's fate might never be fully known, but his disappearance had been the thread that unraveled the entire scheme. Standing upon the rails, Pinkerton removed his hat and bowed his head briefly. "Not in vain," he murmured. When he returned to Chicago, he entered his office and penned the final entry in his journal of the affair. The railroad mysteries stand resolved. The phantoms were men, the whispers were lies, the blood was real. Fear is the enemy's sharpest blade, yet truth is sharper still. Let it be remembered that treason hides not only in battlefields but also in ledgers and shadows. And let every mile of iron laid for the Union be guarded, for the war is fought as much on the rails as on the field. He closed the book and set it upon the shelf beside others, records of cases past, each a testament to the hidden battles that shaped the nation. Then, with his coat upon his arm and his hat square upon his head, Allan Pinkerton stepped out into the bustling streets. Somewhere, another mystery waited. The rails, after all, carried not only soldiers and freight but secrets. And where secrets moved, Allan Pinkerton would follow. The iron road stretched ahead, endless and unyielding, its rhythm the heartbeat of a nation at war.